Good evening, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of John Butler's series of talks on his career as an engineer. And part 3 is entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Lewis. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this third and last presentation on the background to engineering. I started off with the first talk saying engineering is fun, and I still believe that is really what we need to get across to everybody. Engineering is fun. And I just want to go through tonight some of the good things that have happened, and as the title suggests, there'll be some others as well that's not so good. But first, I started off by saying how I became an itinerant engineer in the first talk. I want to go back even further tonight and say how I became an engineer at all, because none of the family, close or distant, had anything to do with engineering that I'm aware of. And we ask children in schools now, what is an engineer, when we go in to see them. And I think if anyone had asked me that when I was at school, certainly in the first school, I wouldn't have had any idea, I don't think. So I didn't get off to do too good a start. I did manage to get through to a grammar school, but I was in the lower stream there. To be honest, I think in most subjects other than maths, I was probably in the lower half of the lower stream as well. That is until year 3. It was an unusual grammar school at the time because at year 3 they started teaching woodwork, metalwork and engineering drawing, which was most unusual. And it was then that things really started to change. At year 3 we had a new form master, Mr. Hayes, who also was the teacher for metalwork and engineering drawing. And he really was the first inspirational person that I came across. And that's what really changed everything. The subjects weren't just practical subjects. They were very much involved in theory as well. I learned all about angular rings and medullary rays and the cambium layers to do with woodwork. And you can look those up if you want. And I also wrote, basically became a thesis on tin plate manufacture. So there's a lot of theory involved as well. So I love the subjects. I really got involved in them and I really started changing at that stage. In fact, in the final year, I stayed over after school. We started making props for the school play. It was going to be Henry IV, Part 1. And I was making swords. They were heavy metal swords with wooden handles. And I don't think today they'd get past the health and safety people for a school production, but they were really effective swords. And it came up to O-levels. You could take up to 8 O-levels. So I chose the 5 subjects I thought I could do. But Mr. Hayes had a different idea. He said I was the only one eligible to take 8 subjects. Therefore, I was going to take 8 subjects. So I did, and passed in 5, which I think told its own story. He also wanted me to stay on and do A-level, but my parents had other ideas, so I left school after the O-level and applied for 5 apprenticeships in engineering companies. I was accepted for 3 of them. I was considered not suitable for the 4th, and I'm still waiting to hear about the 5th. I have no response yet. So on my birthday in 1960, I started what turned out to be an absolutely excellent apprenticeship program, a student apprenticeship program at Hardy Spicer in Birmingham. It was a 5-year program. The first year was in the apprentice school. And then the next 12 months, we toured around various production shop floor sections, which was an absolutely brilliant way of understanding the real basics of engineering and what it's about. and what the real problems are when you have to make it yourself. Then there was 18 months going through the various different offices, and the final 18 months was in your chosen area. And the same time I was doing day release and block release at Aston Technical College, which later became Aston University. So I spent a very enjoyable time doing the apprenticeship, and at the final stage of the office, I went into the jig and tool design office for a 6-month period. And that was the first time I went into the real design part of it, which is really my first love. That was really good. And I was enjoying my time in there. And at my board, I was looking across, and there was a chap in the corner with a board twice the size of anybody else's, and what looked like an exceptionally complex design on his board. And I thought, I wonder if I ever get to do something like that. That's really good. I went in one morning, and the chap wasn't there in the corner. And the section leader came up to me and he said, Fred in the corner, or whatever his name was, we've had to get rid of him because he just wasn't competent. Would I go over and sort out the problem and take on the job? So that was one of the first lessons I learned. If you get a challenge, take it on. So I did that. Then it came up to the final 18 months of training. And at Hardy Spicer, there were 3 drawing offices at the time. There was the jig and tool office I'd been in. There was about 20 people in there. And then there was the very large production design office for the prop shafts, because Hardy Spicer made prop shafts for all sorts of vehicles. One of the biggest prop shaft manufacturers in the world. And in there was probably about 30 people. And then the far end of this large block, there was a small office with just about 6 people in it, which was called the Advanced Design Office. And when it came time for my specialisation, they said, did I want to go into the Advanced Design Office? And I said, did I want to go in the Advanced Design? Yes, I did, please. So I went in there, and it was fantastic. At the time, it was when the Hardy Spicer had taken on a constant velocity joint, which as a very small part of the manufacturing. Alex Isigonis was a person who was credited with designing the Mini vehicle, which basically changed the whole world of motoring and the automotive business. It was the first really effective front-wheel drive. There have been other front-wheel drive vehicles, but nothing on the scale of the Mini. And if you look at I've got a book on the Mini Adventure, which I really like. And if you look at that, then Isigonis was challenged by Sir Leonard Lord, who was the boss of British Leyland at the time, or BMC, I think he was at the time, to design a small, compact vehicle, which he did. And he had these brilliant ideas of turning the engine through 90 degrees, and coming out from there, it wasn't then really feasible to put a drive shaft through to the rear wheels, so we thought he'd drive the front wheels. And in 1957, he had come up with the concept of the Mini, which was his challenge, and he met it. The only problem was he couldn't effectively drive it, because using the drive shafts that were around at the time, they were not giving constant velocity, and they gave a very, very poor performance to the vehicle. And if they'd have driven it as it was, he would have just shaken everything to bits. So the planned production for the Mini in 1958 didn't happen. But one of Isigonis's engineers had heard about a guy called Bill Cole, who was developing a constant velocity joint. In fact, he'd been working on a constant velocity joint for about 25 years. It was a Jepper joint, which was an American joint, which was a sort of constant velocity joint, but it was never thought it out to be able to be manufactured and work effectively. So Bill Cole took on the challenge of trying to get it to work. He was actually with a company called Scott Motorcycles in the north of England, but this was his passion to get it to work. He was a brilliant engineer. And when they approached him, in fact, what they did, Hardy Spicer just bought out the company lock, stock and barrel to buy the product, to buy the designs, but more importantly, to get hold of Bill Cole. And in the next few years, Bill Cole developed that joint to make it a feasible working joint. And he designed the special purpose tooling and machines that were needed to make the tracks in the joint so that they would work. And it was Bill Cole who was the director of this advanced design office. And he'd got a bit of a recluse by then, but he was still churning out some brilliant ideas. It was the guy called IMechE, or Jerzy Maszyński, who was a Polish guy, came over during the war and never went back to Poland, and he was the manager of the department. So I spent a very nice time in the advanced design office. I spent the last 18 months of my apprenticeship there. And when it came to the end, I was offered a permanent position, which was brilliant. 6 weeks after finishing my apprenticeship, the section leader of the department left. And I was amazed when Matt came to me and said, would I be section leader of the advanced design office? And I thought, this is unbelievable, but that's what I became. And I spent a great time in that office. Now, I would have spent a lot more time had things not happened as they did a few years later, which I'll come on to in a bit. The time in that office was absolutely brilliant. When I moved in, we had 2 designs of constant velocity joint. By the time I left 4.5 years later, we had 12 different designs of CV joint. We had a double plunging joint, an offset joint, a large angle joint. It was a phenomenal time for the advancing engineering, which made it so great. That 4.5 years I was there was potentially the best time of my career, to be honest. It was absolutely excellent. It was a learning curve like you wouldn't believe. So in 4.5 years, I was running the office. I was doing 2 and 3 nights a week at college to get further qualifications for the institution. And I'd got married and we'd had our first child. So it was an absolutely exhausting but fantastic time. I remember one night I used to cycle to work and college and everywhere else. And I went to college one night, and the next thing I remember, I actually heard it. The lecturer said, if someone will wake up Mr. Butler, we'll now go for our tea break. So that was the sort of work that was going on. It was a fantastic time, as I say, and very hard work. But it wasn't all work. It had a great atmosphere, and there was a lot of enjoyment that came out of it. And at one stage, we had 2 new guys come into the office. One was an Oxford graduate, and the other was a Cambridge graduate. Both came in at the same time. The Oxford guy was a fairly quiet, reserved person, but the Cambridge scholar, Julian, he was a great character. At university, he was in the college fencing team, and his home was some grand estate somewhere in Norfolk, and I think the parents were sort of the landowners. He was the only person in the office that, apart from the manager, who had a car, and he was a Mini. and on the side he had painted crossed swords because of his fencing at college, and also the family crest. So that's the sort of person he was. He decided one day that he would make a ring for his girlfriend. So he did a lot of planning. He managed to get hold of some gold. He worked out how much he needed. He got hold of a fire brick. He carved an annulus in the fire brick, carefully measured it, calculated exactly how much gold needed to go in there. And on one of the sections I'd been on, they had a small furnace, and we knew that we could borrow this furnace one lunchtime and use it because I got on well with the people on the section. So Julian worked out what time he needed, what temperature he needed, and one lunchtime we all trooped down to the furnace, put the gold around the annulus, put the fire brick in the furnace, and waited very carefully and timed it. When the due time arrived, we took it out, and there it was, nothing. Nobody had realised that fire brick is porous, and the gold had gone into thousands of little globules all around the fire brick. I don't know whether Julian still owns that fire brick to date, but it must be one of the most expensive fire bricks there was, I think. So Mac and I got on exceptionally well. We respected each other and we had great ideas. We didn't always agree though. And I remember one day that I was working on the board designing something, and Mac came up and he had a different view on what I should be doing from what I thought I should be doing. So we were discussing this, and when I say discussing, I think he got into a bit more of a heated discussion. And we were both putting our points forward, and what we hadn't realised, it was getting more and more intense. And we hadn't realised our voices were probably getting a bit louder and louder as we went on. And suddenly we stopped. And not only were the half a dozen people in our office stopped work and just standing staring at us, but so were the 30-odd people in the accounts department just across the way, just staring at us. And Mac just very calmly said, "I think we better discuss this in my office." And we walked off. So that was the sort of relationship we were able to have. He was a great person, fully respected him. But after a few years, what had been happening in the background is that the mighty GKN group had set up a company called BRD in Aldridge to make prop shafts as a competitor to Hardy Spicer. But they never really got off the ground. They made some, they sold some to Ford, but the rest of the motor industry, they had no joy at all. So they started they made an aggressive bid for buying up the Burfield Group, which was the owner of Hardy Spicer. And it went on for quite a time. In fact, I've actually got, it went to the mergers people, and I've actually got a copy of the GKN and Burfield discussions that went on for that period. But in the end, they actually did buy up the Burfield Group. Now, if you read the history of GKN, which again, I've got a copy of the history of GKN, it'll tell you in there about the bid they put in for Burfield. And it'll also tell you the fact that they won the bid and they took over. Now, GKN became a very big company in making prop shafts, but then onto CV joints. And they're the world leader in CV joint manufacture. But what the book doesn't tell you, and what none of the people who mentioned in the book tell you, is that when they took over the Burfield Group, they took it over purely for prop shafts. They didn't believe there was any future in front-wheel drive. They didn't believe there was any future in the CV joint. So when they took it over, they were going to sell off the business of CV joints, and they were closing the office that I was in at the time. So I then started looking elsewhere, and IMechE fully knew and understood that I was looking for jobs elsewhere. And I put my name down at an agency, and they came up with a few ideas, but nothing ever came to much. And then one Friday, I had a call from the agency, and they said, "We found the perfect position for you." They said, "It's a Salisbury transmission." And I said, "Oh, forget it." I said, "We haven't told you what the job is yet." I said, "I'm not interested. That's the same group that I'm already with, and I want to get out of that group." They said, well, we've sent you all the details in the post, and there's an open interview for you on Monday if you want to go. I said, "Well, you can do what you want, but I'm not interested." Anyway, Saturday came, and duly enough, the information came in the post, which I didn't take much notice of. Saturday afternoon, I was taken ill. On Sunday, I spent the whole day in bed, not at all well. And on Monday, I still wasn't very bright in the morning. And I got up about lunchtime. And after lunch, my wife said, "For goodness sake," I think she was fed up of my moaning around the house. She said, "Why don't you go out and go for that interview?" So I did. Not a wise thing to do, I must admit, but I did go down for the interview. And I went to Salisbury Transmission, and I went in, I saw a person who gave me some forms. And quite honestly, I don't think she knew quite what she was doing, but I filled in the form, and I sat in the office on my own, and she came in and said, "The person you want to see is busy at the moment. Do you mind waiting?" So I said, "No, I'll wait." And I was getting worse. And eventually someone turned up, took one look at the form and said, "You don't want me. You want production, you want engineering. I'm on manufacturing." I said, "That's right. Sorry about that." He said, and disappeared. Short time later, she came back in and said, "Oh, sorry, the person you want in with the director, do you mind waiting?" So again, I said, "I'll wait." So I was sitting on my own in the office, waiting, absolutely fed up. My pregnant wife and 18-month-old daughter were sitting in the car outside, and eventually someone came in. The chief engineer came in, and we did an interview. And at the end of the interview, he sat back in his chair, looked at me and said, "You don't want this job, do you?" And I said, "No, I must apologise. I've been saying all the time, I don't want this job. I'm very sorry." "Okay," he said, "would you be interested in being my assistant?" And I thought, what? He said, "Well, don't get your hopes up," he said. It's something I've just thought of. I haven't discussed it with the director. I haven't put any application or anything in, so we might not have the budget, we might not be able to do anything. But leave it with me, we'll be in touch." So I said, "Thank you very much." Went back and was back to work on the Tuesday, and didn't hear anything Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, heard nothing. On Friday morning, I was working at my board, and IMechE walked through the office, shuffled past my desk and said, "Come in the office." And I thought, "Oh, what's wrong with IMechE?" So I followed him into his office, and he said, "I'm very disappointed." I said, "What's wrong, Matt?" He said, "I'm disappointed you haven't told me you've got another job." I said, "I haven't got another job, Matt. So I've been for an interview, you know that, you know I've been going for interviews, but I haven't heard anything yet." He said, "Oh, well, you've got the job." So I thought, that's a good way of finding out you've got another job. And he came through on the Saturday morning, offer for the job, and they'd actually offered me £50 a year more than we'd been discussing. So I was pleased with that. So getting back to the good, bad and ugly, it's some of the things in your career that are things that are well worth remembering. They're not always the best things, but they're good things. And a couple of things I'll go through. In 1968, the Daily Express ran a competition called the London-Sydney Marathon. And it was basically to try and bring the country out of the doom and gloom and get people interested in something else. And it was to drive vehicles from London to Sydney, basically in the fastest time. And it had about 100 car entries into it. But we were approached by the Roots Group competitions department to supply axle centres. And we'd said to them, why only axle centres? Why don't you want complete axles? And they said, well, we're beefing up the axles. We're getting special tubes, high-grade tubes made, and special hubs and discs and brakes and everything. So we supplied them with the axle centres. And I thought no more about it for a long time. And I didn't follow the rally. I didn't have the Express, so I didn't know what was going on. But one day I had a phone call, and a rather agitated voice says, is there any way you can strengthen tubes under a vehicle on an axle? I said, sorry, who are you? What do you want? He said, it's Roots competition. He says, the vehicles are off on the rally now, but the tubes are bending. I said, just a minute, I seem to remember this. Didn't you have special high strength tubes made for these? He said, well, the people who made them couldn't get the right material. And basically, what they've done, they've supplied us more or less mild steel tubes. Oh, dear. I said, well, I don't know what your design of the vehicle is underneath, but if you can get some steel plate, make it into a bridge type structure, take a section out in the middle to go over the axle centre, and then weld it all along the tubes. That's all I can suggest. Thank you very much, he said, put the phone down. And that was it. I thought no more about it at all. Well, much later that year, I went to the motor show. And as I was walking past the Roots stand, there was this Hillman Hunter covered in mud, up on bricks and stones. And it says, the winning car of the London-Sydney Marathon. No, I didn't even know that I'd won the London-Sydney Marathon. I thought, I wonder. So I crawled underneath the vehicle and looked, and there was a big steel plate welded all along the axle tube. And I thought, that's me. So that was really a wonderful time. Another one is did a lot of work with Korea, and one of the companies we dealt with is a company called Kia, who nowadays is well known, but at those times nobody had heard of Kia. They made one basic vehicle, and that was a 1.25 ton military jeep for the Korean army. And we had proposed to them a limited slip differential, which was helping the grip on the ground for it. And we'd supplied some samples of the limited slip differential. And I went out to Korea one time, and I planned to go to Kia to see them. And they were just about moved into a brand new factory out in the country. And when I got there, it was pretty much a building site. There's a few offices and a bit of a factory, but most of it was a building site. I went into the meeting, and it was like a boardroom, a long boardroom table. And the chief engineer was at one end, and I sat at the other end, and along both sides were all his engineers. And we were discussing various things. And I said, well, have you fitted the limited slip diffs to the vehicles? He said, yes. I said, and how do they perform? He said, well, we haven't tested them. I said, well, why not? He said, well, we don't really know whether they'd work or not. Well, I've been dealing with Korea for quite a time, and I knew that one of the things they were was very competitive. So I took a bit of a risk, and I stood up And I pointed at the chief engineer and I said, you drive your vehicle, I'll drive the vehicle you fitted with a limited dip. Any test you want and I'll beat you. And he went quiet. And I thought, ah. And then he smiled and said, okay. So we went down and it was my lucky day because every single test that we went through on this building site, through lakes, up hills, across boulders, I beat him in every one. So I think, again, that was just knowing your product and knowing that it can work. I think the last one on the very good items was we'd been dealing for a long time with Volkswagen in Germany and trying to get in on a new truck program that they were running. And if we'd have got it, it would have been probably one of the biggest contracts we had. And I was going out there probably about once a month, once every 3 weeks, once a month, just keeping the program going and talking about things and developing it. And I went out one time and I was met by my contact. We went in a different direction from what we normally do. So we went into a room, which again was like a large boardroom, with a whole host of people in there, and most of whom I didn't recognise and know who they were. And very abruptly, we sat down, no introductions, and they just started firing questions at me, question after question after question. And I thought, what's going on here? And I was answering the best I could, giving answers to everyone. And then finished, it went quiet. And they said, right. And they handed me a document and said, well, there's your pre-production order. And I said, what? Thank you very much. Totally unexpected, didn't know about it. So I came out of the meeting, went to the nearest phone box I could get to, phoned back to the company and said, I've got the pre-production order. And my boss's reaction, he said, you didn't go out for that. Oh, thank you very much. No, I didn't, but I've got it. He said, well, can you come back into the office? Because I was flying back that afternoon. Can you come back into the office before you go home? I said, yeah, okay. So I got to the airport and fog, flight delayed. So by the time the flight came back, it was late evening and I didn't get back into the office. I went home. I got in next morning and they said, well, where were you last night? I told them. I said, oh, that's a pity. We got the champagne on ice and all the board had stayed behind to celebrate, but we had to do it without you. So that was it. Missed out. So those are the good things. The whole host of good things. They far, far outnumber any bad ones. I think one of the worst things I can say on the bad one is whenever I travel, I always travelled in a suit. It was just something I was used to. One time I went out to Korea with my then boss, and he moaned and moaned at me about going in a suit, going casual, he said. And in the end, he convinced me to travel back in my casual clothes, pack the suit. But what it meant is I didn't have any pockets to put things. So in my hand baggage, I'd put everything, my wallet, passport, everything I'd got in there. We came back and flew in via Paris, and we were staying in Paris overnight before flying back to Birmingham the next day. So we had a taxi to the hotel, and when we got to the hotel, there was a lot of commotion going on. By the time I got to the reception desk, I put my case down, and then where's my hand baggage? Totally disappeared, just gone. So no passport, no money, you know, everything that was important had gone. So that was really a bad thing. And coming back, I reported the police, got the notes and everything else. Getting out of Paris was no problem without a passport. Getting back into Birmingham without a passport was really, really difficult. One of the things that had gone was company credit cards. which I immediately reported to the company. And we had a system at the company at the time that every month the accounts department would send me what I'd spent on the company credit card, ask me to sign it off and send it back. And about a month or so afterwards, I got a note came through from the accounts department saying, would I sign and send it back? And I looked at this and I thought, I've bought a several £100 suit from a high-class tailor's in Paris. That's interesting. Nobody queried it. They just sent it through. Would I sign it off? So I said, no, I didn't buy it. It had gone with everything else on the trip out to Paris. I said good, bad, and ugly. Well, that's the good and the bad. The ugly is, I put it down to a few things. When you travel, there are some things that are not so good that you see. One time in Korea, I don't know, some of you may recall that back in I think it was the late 90s, there was a lot of uprising from students in Korea, a lot of protests going on in the centre of Seoul. And one of the times I was out there, these protests were happening. Now, I was out in the companies at the time, but the police and the military had dispersed the students using tear gas. And I was staying in the centre of Seoul, and when we got back into Seoul that afternoon, you could still smell the tear gas. And we went out in the evening for dinner, and just walking from the hotel, and this was some hours afterwards, walking from the hotel to the restaurant, by the time we got there, our eyes were streaming. What it must have been like in the day, I have no idea. But two other episodes that weren't particularly nice was I was in Thailand, going out one not rather nice day, walking along the main street, and all along the street there was a whole series of traders there, like a marketplace. Very busy, very active, very nice market. Suddenly things started to seem a bit odd, and people started moving around rather rapidly, and there's a lot of shouting and talking going on. And I thought, strange, what's happening? And a lot of these market traders were throwing everything on their barrows and running down side streets. And then I saw what's happening. There's a whole load of police in trucks just coming along, and everyone who hadn't managed to get away, they were just lifting up the market stalls, throwing them on the trucks, and they're just getting rid of this market. But I think the worst one was in India. When I used to go from the hotel out to where I was working, there's lots of slums in India. And I've been through a few of them, but going on this journey, there was one hillside that was absolutely covered in sort of cloth tents and cardboard tents, and a whole host of people just there. It was a massive sort of what you describe as a slum area. One morning we were travelling out in the car, and as we were getting close to this area, there was a lot of activity, and the closer we got, there were more and more police and military roaming the streets. And as we turned the corner, this hillside was just completely bare, nothing there at all. Overnight, they just brought in the diggers and completely cleared everything out. And I thought, I couldn't understand these people, and I thought, such a shame. You know, it's not their fault they're there. And these are the sort of things that I describe as the ugly side of what's happening in the world. Anyway, I don't want to finish on a downbeat, so I'll go back to engineering is fun. I think I'll just tell you one little story that covers good, bad, ugly, and it also covers one of the requirements of the institution for becoming a fellow. If anyone's looked at those requirements, one of the things that a say as an example that you could use is influencing company policy. And I think I had that. I had a company car and it had gone in for something to be done for a week. And so I borrowed a car. And the car I borrowed was a Maserati bi-turbo. It was a vehicle we'd had on loan from Maserati. We'd supplied the axles for it and we were doing some development work on it. And it needed mileage on it, so I had it for a week. Now, there are only two of these cars in the world. One was with us and one was with Maserati. So I spent a very enjoyable, good week driving around in a Maserati bi-turbo. Now, these were the early days of turbocharging, and I don't think Maserati quite had it right because the turbos were vicious. You'd drive along and suddenly, at no particular point in time, they would kick in and it was almost as though you'd lit a rocket and it shot off. But I had a good week, good drive around, it was very nice. On the Friday morning, I thought, well, I better refuel this before I take it back. So I took it into the local garage here, which is on an island, filled it up, drove off the garage forecourt onto the island, but the island had a bit of a negative camber on it. And as I was going halfway around the island, it had been a bit of a damp night, the turbos suddenly cut in and the car just spun round. And unfortunately, it spun round and the rear wheels hit the curb, which collapsed the whole of the rear suspension. That's the ugly bit. It was ugly looking at that. And I wasn't very popular. The fact that it was a prototype development car, there weren't replacement parts, and it took some months to get it back on the road and working again. And affecting the company policy, I certainly did that. They made the decision that development cars were not to be loaned out again. And that was where I met all three of the requirements. So that's it for tonight, and that's it for this series of talks. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you managed to enjoy some of it at least, and I wish you a good night for that. Thank you, Lewis.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Is there any questions anyone would like to ask?
No questions, but very interesting.
No question. I will give you my version when I'm that old. When I retire.
Looking forward to hearing it.
Sorry, Jean-Luc, will you say something?
I said I will give you my version when I retire, but I'm not there yet. So thank you very much, John.
I haven't retired yet, Jean-Luc.
Have you not? I thought you had.
No, I still work.
Anyway, thank you very much, John.
Not very many days, but I still work a bit.
Okay, if there's no further questions, we'll draw it to a close. Thanks very much, John.
Okay, bye. Thank you very much, and I hope to see some people at our future events. Hope you join us.